Welcome back to Markets Today. This is always a space where we try and see what are the key drivers for investments, at least when we focus on the local financial markets. Today, we're taking a different tangent. We're looking at the value of intellectual property. Is this worth your while? What is it? How do you capture it? In studio, we are joined by Mr. Ogwang. If you're just joining this session, earlier on, he took us through the key tenets of intellectual property. This is really what stands out for me. It's the creation of the human mind. But if you don't take this creation to the market, it's only an idea and it means nothing. Before we took the break, Ogwang told us that Safaricom is able to appropriate the most value in as far as intellectual property is concerned. He's given me an interesting statistic. He's told me that the trademark affiliated with M-Pesa is not even registered here. It's registered in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Ogwang,
yes.
Tell me more about this green that I see and I interact with.
And so, be fair, when you look at M-Pesa, and that's if your viewer will appreciate this one fact, then my job is done.
Your job is done. Fantastic.
What is M-Pesa? What was before M-Pesa? There was something called Telegram, right? And people would send money through Telegram. What M-Pesa has done is that M-Pesa has put in place an entirely new industry, altogether with a supply chain. So what is an industry as far as intellectual property is concerned? An industry is a product or a service that puts in place its own new supply chain. Before M-Pesa, we didn't have agents, right? So the value of M-Pesa is not in those colors.
Yes.
Those colors are just attributive value components. The value of M-Pesa is that M-Pesa is an industry of its own. Intellectual property, an idea, if that idea cannot be graduated to an industry, it's a wasted idea.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
It's the same conversation that we have with Uber. What is Uber? Someone might think that Uber is just a mobile taxi hailing app. No, Uber has put in place an entirely new industry. The same with Airbnb. So if we are really to look at our spaces, and if we are really to look at the spaces in which our brands and our products operate in, then we'll ask ourselves, are we operating in markets that someone else owns? Right? So if we are operating in markets that someone else owns, then guess what? That individual sets the pace of that market. And that's why in whichever conversation you go to, as far as people are talking about mobile money transfer, Safaricom will always chart that conversation.
Exactly.
Why? Because they framed that market, and that market has been graduated into its own industry. So the reason why Vodafone registered M-Pesa, right, as a trademark, is because the engine that runs M-Pesa is an entirely new industry.
Wow.
And that industry has seeped into every other traditional industry that we used to have. So in intellectual property, the awareness is the individual that came up with this, right?
The glass or the water?
Okay. Okay, the glass. The person that sells this glass and the person that owns the rights to this mold, who owns that industry?
The person who owns the rights to the mold.
Exactly. So intellectual property then moves to enable an individual, regardless of whatever you're doing. You could be a dancer. If you can come up with a dance choreography, that becomes part of your intellectual property. If you're a singer and you come up with a specific way of arriving or hitting your chords, that becomes your intellectual property. So intellectual property cannot be narrowed down. But because we are talking about markets and performance of some of these commodities at the NSE, then we are beginning to ask ourselves, if company X is valuing their shares at Y,
exactly,
right? Is that one harnessing the shareholder value? Or could there be aspect of the shareholder value that as at now we are still living
on the table?
Dormant.
Next question. You're preempting. You're getting the intellectual property from my mind already. So we are communicating and creating value here.
Yes.
So when you look at, let's stick with this, the case of Safaricom, because that's a dominant player here. They're dominant in terms of, I mean, not dominant, but they are certainly up there in as far as appropriating value on their financial statements as well as to shareholders.
Yes.
This value affiliated with M-Pesa as a product, this is a product that's registered in the United Kingdom. Is this value, do you think it's captured on the price that we see on the Nairobi Stock Exchange? Because if I look at it from a fundamental perspective, as somebody in the investment industry, I would look at how much revenue has been generated today.
Sure.
How much revenue do I expect maybe over the next 5 years?
Yes.
And then I would discount it to today.
Okay.
You know, and then I'd put a price tag.
Okay.
The other way I'd look at it is to say, how much dividend will I get from this company?
Okay.
How much will they give me? So if they give me a certain amount for 5 years, I discount it at a level that I feel is reflective of the kind of return that I want.
Okay.
Then I put a price tag.
Okay.
Does that capture? That's typically how the market sort of prices these assets. So are these markets, are the investors pricing in intellectual property, or as you said, are we leaving value on the table?
We are leaving a lot of value dormant.
Explain. How much value are we leaving on the table?
The weakness of that valuation model is that valuation model is reactional.
Okay.
So then that means the value shrinks, right?
Yes.
According to factors around us. There are certain values that are meant to be constant, regardless of market factors. Some of those values are what we call foundational values in building a brand. Those values are not, I don't see it in board of some of these organizations, but I'm just asking, when they are developing the balance sheet of Safaricom, do they ever equate this is the value of the name M-Pesa?
So there's normally a component that's captured as part of the intangible assets.
Yes,
so there's a component that's captured.
Yes.
But when you're looking at Safaricom in terms of valuation,
Yes.
typically you would look at the cash flows. You would not look at I have something that I think the intellectual value of it is X. We look at how much value are you getting.
And that's why
from
I'm
this.
asking. And that's why I'm asking Mbithe, would M-Pesa be M-Pesa if it was color violet or indigo?
No, it
So then
wouldn't.
that means
Yes.
that shade is not only something, that shade is a main factor at how people attend and how people relate with that brand. So then that means that green ought to be their intellectual property.
But how do I put a money value on it? Because it's a feel-good factor, I can't ignore it. But how do I put a money feel to it? Because you will look at it and you will engage with it. But, okay, let me put it differently,
Okay.
Ogwang.
Yes,
so
yes,
you
Mbithe.
walk in, as you said, you look like you like the color green. You know, I'm not too sure. Maybe you have dollars in
I
your
love
account
red.
and
I
not
love
shillings.
red.
Thank you. So you walk out and you see a whole big banner of
Yes.
of M-Pesa, and maybe it elicits a certain reaction or response to you. How do I price that? Because really that's intellectual property,
Yes,
that's the
yes,
value.
yes.
How do I put a price to the happiness or to the feelings that you feel affiliated with this brand, which is a strong brand?
Yes,
Because if
yes.
I can't put a feeling, as an analyst, I'm like, if I can't put a number to that feeling,
Yes.
then how do I extract it if I wanted to make value out of
It's
that?
this, we are defining that color.
Yes.
Have you ever seen a yellow car?
Yes, I saw one.
It's
It didn't feel
very
good.
hard to see.
It's hard to
find.
see one, and it's
they
not
did a
appealing.
research in early 70s.
Yes.
And they realized that when vehicles were engaged in accident, 9 out of 10 instances it was because of color yellow. And they said that the human brain reacts negatively to color yellow.
Okay.
And so car manufacturers said it's in very rare instances we will always churn out color yellow, because there is a value in that point that you're talking about. The emotional component is actually arrived at by a specific definition. Why color green? What are the value propositions of color green? What does color green elicit in an individual? Right?
Okay.
And if we identify that color green elicits the same in an individual, does that one translate back to the way we are going about our industry and the way our product is metamorphosing itself? So what is color green? Color green is meant to be lively, fertile, right? Has M-Pesa been fertile?
Yes, it has.
More than anything else, right? So what I'm trying to say, this is a conversation that actually, it's one of those conversations that we should actually begin from, even people of Institute of Certified Public Accountants, that can we begin to sensitize accountants to begin appreciating intellectual property? And that's what I'm saying. Now they can say the value, the intangible value of company X in our balance sheet is worth Y, but that one is not defined enough.
Okay, but then you know where that conversation comes
Yes,
a lot, at
yes.
least where I hear it more often than not.
Yes.
For the listed companies, the intellectual property, the intangible asset is really, as you said, it's a value driver for extracting
Yes.
value from cash flows, rather,
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
the environment that
Yeah.
this company is working. Where I hear this conversation and people pushing for the valuation more so is in startups, where somebody says, I've come up with this idea
Yes.
and I've packaged it.
Yes.
But there's always that place of, when I look at it as an investment bank, I'm like,
Yeah.
good for you.
Yes.
What's the money around it?
Yes.
But then there's always that haggle of, if you're trying to do a fundraise for a company,
Yes.
they will tell you, no, my company is valued at 100 million,
Yes.
but then the revenues are 1 million.
Yes.
And you're like, then why is the value 100 million?
Yes.
They say because of intellectual property.
Yes.
And I'm like, that doesn't make sense, because as an investment banker,
Yes.
I will value 1 million is what you brought to the table
Yes.
last year.
Yes.
How much do you think this will be for the next 5 years?
Yes.
And then I discount that.
Yes.
When you tell me that, no, your idea, what you have, which you don't want the world to know, is 100 million, there's always a point of conflict.
Okay.
How do I then sort of navigate this? Because at least for the bigger brands, for the banks, for the people who are out there and have been doing business for a while, they can talk about it, but they have learned, as you said, to create a market around it.
Actually, very few banks in Kenya have actually created markets.
All right.
All these are just operating from a point of commodity.
Yes.
Very few banks have products. Very few insurance companies in Kenya have distinct products.
Okay.
What most of these people do is merely to copy and paste, copy and paste, copy and paste.
Yes.
But when you're talking about when someone is valuing an organization and saying, Mbithe, I wish to start this company and I'm valuing this at 100 million. And then you ask me, what is money in that? And I will ask you, Mbithe, what is money? Because there's a huge point of departure between currency, that paper that people have in their pocket, and money. Of course, you being an investment banker, you are aware with the gold something, what it was called, what conference, something, okay, that one.
Okay.
Whereby they had to shift from
Yes.
the gold standard
Yes,
to
okay.
what we call fiat currency.
Yes.
Money operates at multiple levels. Idea is a form of currency if that idea can be crystallized, so that we appreciate that the reason why people are advancing to M-Pesa is that M-Pesa is not only sending money. M-Pesa has put in place an entirely new industry. And so we ask ourselves, what is the value of that industry? Whenever we are looking at startups, then we ask ourselves this, and this is one of the questions that I ask most entrepreneurs. Have we ever defined who is an entrepreneur? Because more often, we are always saying that someone who is in a venture of generating revenue is an entrepreneur. That is not an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is any organization or an individual that has come up with a product or a service that operates within an existing market infrastructure.
Exactly.
The moment an individual gets out of that existing market infrastructure, that is an industrial product.
I love what you're saying. There's a multiplier effect.
Yeah.
The value, the true value of intellectual property, create an idea, identify a market for it. If I share this idea with you, Ogwang,
okay.
and then you go sell it and you make money, you will come back again and ask, what's the next idea? So you sort of create a loop. Because I like the fact, the context that you bring in, there has to be a multiplier effect in terms of value moving around. Because the only way I can get you to come back and tap into my intellectual property and this intangible asset is if I show you, this is M-Pesa, you can be an agent here. You make some money when you go and do the agency. Or if you're a client and you're a user, you're like, Ogwang, here is M-Pesa, send money to your mother and you don't have to go up country.
Sure.
So I'm saving you. So I'm showing you the value. I'm not just telling you M-Pesa is a good brand. I'm telling you, if you do that, it means tomorrow you'll come back again like, hey, I sent money up country and it was easy. Can I send to to my uncle. So I
Very
really like
true.
what you brought out. There has to be a multiplier effect component for then an industry to be created around this intellectual property asset, for you then to put a money value to it and to say, this is the value we've brought. And I think the other thing I'm gleaning from this conversation, and something that you've challenged me, and I need to go back to the drawing board,
Yes.
is you're telling me I'm looking at Safaricom from the future financials,
Yes.
but perhaps
Which
I
is
have
purely reactional.
yes, reactional. Perhaps I've forgotten to look at the industry and see what's the value that's been appropriated to the industry, and what's the likelihood that the value that comes back to Safaricom increases as the value of the intellectual property grows.
Yes. Now, thank you very much. I want to mention a few things in passing.
But we are sort of short of time, so we need to we need to sort of now come to our closing remarks. So maybe you can be brief, then we can take.
Okay. One of the challenges that people have, especially at the marketplace, there's a huge difference between a property and an asset. And once a thing still remains as property, it's useless at the marketplace. So the holder of an intellectual property needs to identify how to grow that intellectual property into an intellectual asset. So what is a property? A property is anything tangible or intangible that an individual owns that has value.
Okay.
Right? But an asset is that thing that an individual owns, tangible or intangible, that has value that can be readily converted into its financial equivalent component. Wow. So there's a huge difference, especially when talking about valuation of an organization. Most of us tie valuation on profitability, and that is not sustainable. More often than not, that is reactional. Kodak had been profitable since it started, but guess what? Kodak wasn't productive. So in intellectual property, we begin to look at what components in these organizations are value drivers, that those value drivers are constantly depreciating in value. And then we look at, in this organization, what is that one factor, one component that never depreciates in value? Wow. And why doesn't it depreciate in value? Intellectual property never depreciates. It's the only resource on earth, second to gold, that always appreciates in value.
So you're telling me I've just been undervaluing myself?
9 out of 10 years.
9 out of 10. I like that, but I must constantly look for. You're also telling me, in as much as you have that intellectual property, if you don't constantly evolve with the market, then you become Kodak and you're not necessarily extracting value or creating value in the market. So then when now I look at my day-to-day and how I look at the value of these companies, if I come back to the Safaricom conversation, you're telling me that I must constantly evaluate whether Safaricom is using its intellectual property and creating value on an annual basis.
On this conversation, if I was to sit with the chief accountant at Safaricom, I would ask him, what are the property segment of Safaricom? And I will ask him equally to draw a line and show me how they have graduated those property components to asset. And that's where most organizations are missing it. So the conversation here is, it's a start of this conversation that we should create awareness, right? Every organization in NASDAQ, right? All their valuation is IP. How is it that us guys, even when we are mentioning IP, we only say intangible resource?
Intangible resource. Fair enough. I think this is the first part of many conversations, and I hope to have you again. But then before we come to the close of it, so then you've created this context of this value that's been left on the table. And you are a lawyer in that space. Help us bridge this conversation as we close it.
Help us bridge.
What's your role in this conversation? What can you do to help people unearth that value?
The worst thing about intellectual property is that intellectual property is voluntary. And that means it's the individual owner. As a lawyer, I'm not allowed to market myself. That's destructive. So it's upon the individual owner, the bearer of proprietary components. Proprietary simply means aspects of ownership. The individual that is bearing proprietary components to identify, Mr. Guang, can you help us create value around our frame? Can you help us create value around our font? If you look at the Safaricom font, is that font genuine? Is that original? No, it's not original. It's not original. And that's the distinction between the Coca-Cola font and the Safaricom font. The Coca-Cola font is actually their original font. So whenever we are looking at people growing practices, I always tell people, think outside the box. If you can frame your own individual font, then you have gotten it right in growing your intellectual property.
All right. Absolute final parting shot, briefly.
The future is IP, and if any organization is to be sustainably productive at the marketplace, whereby you are the only individual that is charting your way forward, whereby you don't come second to the threats of competition, unnecessary competition, the future is for all of us to begin modeling our business competitive models around our forms of IP, and let us grow intellectual property.
All right. Thank you. That was an amazing conversation. I certainly enjoyed, and I learned some things that I've not quite paid attention to. So intellectual property, you must be able to differentiate the property from the asset. Then you must also continuously engage with the market to see how you're giving value as well as extracting value. And what the key thing that I've gotten from this conversation with Mr. Gwang is this: how we are looking at some of these companies on the Nairobi Securities Exchange is we are discounting the future cash flows, but perhaps there's a context of intellectual property and intellectual assets and value that's been created in the industries around them that is not necessarily being captured in the prices. Is that the case? Do you agree with that? If you do, let us know so that we can see, is there more upside in these stocks that we're looking at, especially as the prices come off with COVID. This is the first of one of many conversations. I certainly look forward to be able to engage with him here. He is a lawyer. He focuses on intellectual property, and the value that he can be able to bring to the table is to help you think through the structures and the strategies that you can be able to use to appropriate value. Thank you for joining us today. I hope to see you again same time. Good day.